Welcome to Dialogue Doodles, everyone. I'm your host, Jack, and today we're diving into one of the most fascinating origin stories in the history of philosophy. With me is Professor James Anderson, an expert in ancient philosophy and Stoicism. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jack. It's great to be here.
You know, James, they say that sometimes the worst day of your life can become the beginning of something extraordinary. And there's perhaps no better example of this than the story we're discussing today, the incredible tale of how a devastating shipwreck led to the birth of Stoicism.
Absolutely, Jack. It's one of those remarkable moments in history where personal catastrophe transformed into something that would influence human thought for millennia to come.
Before we dive into the shipwreck itself, could you tell us a bit about Zeno? Who was this merchant who would eventually become one of history's most influential philosophers?
Well, Zeno was born in 334 BCE in Citium, Cyprus, into a prosperous Greco-Phoenician merchant family. He wasn't born a philosopher, he was actually following in his father's footsteps as a successful merchant dealing in valuable purple dye.
So we're talking about someone who was firmly established in the business world, not someone who had always been philosophically inclined.
Exactly. He was what we might today call a successful businessman, focused on material prosperity and trade. His life was all about commerce and wealth accumulation, quite different from the philosophical path he would eventually champion.
And then came the fateful voyage. Can you set the scene for us? What happened in 314 BCE?
Picture this. Zeno is on a merchant ship laden with valuable purple dye, headed for the port of Piraeus near Athens. This was a routine trading voyage for him, one he'd probably done many times before. But this particular journey would end very differently.
I'm already getting shivers. What happened next?
Near the coast of Piraeus, disaster struck. A violent storm arose, and despite the crew's best efforts, the ship went down. Zeno lost everything: his cargo, his wealth, essentially his entire livelihood, all gone in a matter of hours.
That must have been devastating. We're talking about his entire business, his life's work, essentially.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is how Zeno responded to this catastrophe. Instead of falling into despair, he found himself in Athens, still reeling from his losses, when he wandered into a bookseller's shop.
A bookseller's shop? That seems like an unusual destination for someone who's just lost everything.
Well, this is where fate takes an interesting turn. While there, he happened upon a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, which contained teachings of Socrates. The merchant-turned-shipwreck survivor found himself completely absorbed in these philosophical writings.
So it was almost like the shipwreck pushed him into a completely different path?
Exactly. In fact, Zeno was so moved by what he read that he asked the bookseller where he could find men like Socrates. As luck would have it, at that very moment, the cynic philosopher Crates was passing by, and the bookseller pointed him out.
That's quite a coincidence. It almost feels like the universe was conspiring to create a philosopher.
It does seem that way. And you know what's really intriguing? This moment perfectly exemplifies what would later become a core Stoic principle, the idea that external circumstances, even seemingly negative ones, can be opportunities for growth and transformation.
You mean like that modern saying, when one door closes, another opens?
Yes, but the Stoics would take it even further. They would say it's not just about finding new opportunities, but about understanding that what appears to be misfortune might actually be exactly what we need for our personal development.
That's fascinating because it completely reframes how we might think about failure or loss. Instead of asking, why did this happen to me, we might ask, what can this teach me?
Exactly. And this wasn't just theoretical for Zeno. He lived this transformation. From that moment in the bookshop, he began studying under various philosophers in Athens, eventually developing his own philosophical school that would become known as Stoicism.
James, I'm curious. How did Zeno's experience as a merchant and this dramatic loss influence the philosophy he would later develop?
That's a brilliant question, Jack. His merchant background actually had a profound influence on Stoicism. Think about it, here was someone who understood the ups and downs of fortune intimately, who had experienced both material success and complete loss.
So he wasn't just theorizing about dealing with adversity, he'd lived it.
Precisely. And this is what makes Stoicism so practical. Zeno taught that true wealth isn't in external possessions, but in our inner resources, our reason, our ability to choose our response to circumstances, our capacity for virtue.
It's almost like he took the lessons from his personal disaster and turned them into a universal philosophy.
Yes, and what's remarkable is how he systematized these insights. He began teaching in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch in Athens, which is where the name Stoicism comes from. But unlike some philosophical schools that were purely theoretical, Zeno's teachings were grounded in practical wisdom.
Could you give us an example of how this practical wisdom manifested in Stoic teachings?
Well, one of the core Stoic principles is the dichotomy of control, understanding what's in our power and what isn't. Zeno taught that the only things truly in our control are our own thoughts, judgments, and actions. Everything else, including wealth, status, and even our physical circumstances, is ultimately outside our control.
That must have resonated deeply with someone who had experienced such a dramatic loss of external circumstances.
Absolutely. And here's what's fascinating. Zeno argued that this realization wasn't limiting, it was actually liberating. By focusing our energy only on what we can control, we free ourselves from unnecessary anxiety about what we can't.
You know, this reminds me of modern resilience training. Many contemporary psychologists teach similar principles about focusing on what we can control rather than what we can't.
That's right. And it's why Stoicism has had such a revival in recent years. CEOs, athletes, and people dealing with high-stress situations are turning to these ancient teachings because they're so applicable to modern challenges.
It's amazing how a philosophy born from a shipwreck over 2,300 years ago continues to help people navigate their own personal storms today.
And that's the real legacy of Zeno's shipwreck. What seemed like a catastrophic loss became a gift not just to him, but to countless generations that followed. As the Stoics would say, it's not what happens to us, but how we respond to it that matters.
You know, James, I'm struck by how Zeno's story challenges our modern attitudes toward failure and setback. We often try to avoid or quickly escape difficult situations, but it seems like Stoicism suggests a different approach.
That's exactly right, Jack. Zeno's experience taught him that what we perceive as failures or disasters might actually be opportunities for profound growth. The Stoics developed this into the concept of amor fati, love of fate.
Love of fate. That sounds challenging, especially when fate deals you something like a shipwreck.
Indeed, but that's the revolutionary aspect of Stoic thought. It's not about passive acceptance, but rather active engagement with whatever life presents. Think about it, if Zeno had simply tried to rebuild his merchant business, we might not have Stoicism today.
So it's about finding meaning in adversity rather than just enduring it.
Precisely. And this is why Stoicism remains so relevant today. Whether it's losing a job, facing a health crisis, or dealing with any major life disruption, the Stoic approach offers tools for not just surviving but potentially thriving through these challenges.
Could you give our listeners some practical takeaways from Zeno's story? How can they apply these insights in their own lives?
First, remember that setbacks, even severe ones, don't define you, they can refine you. Second, pay attention to unexpected opportunities that might arise from difficult situations. And third, focus your energy on what you can control, your responses and actions, rather than external circumstances.
You mentioned earlier how CEOs and athletes are embracing Stoicism. Are there any specific examples you could share?
Well, take someone like Bill Gates, who regularly cites Stoic principles in his approach to both success and failure. Or look at Olympic athletes who use Stoic techniques to maintain focus under pressure. The common thread is using adversity as a catalyst for growth.
It's fascinating how a philosophy born from a single catastrophic event has provided such universal tools for human resilience.
And that might be Zeno's greatest legacy. He showed us that philosophy isn't just academic theorizing, it's a practical toolkit for living well, especially when life throws us those unexpected storms.
As we wrap up, what final thought would you like to leave with our listeners?
I'd say this: the next time you face a personal shipwreck, whatever form it takes, remember Zeno. Remember that what feels like an ending might actually be the beginning of something transformative. It's not about waiting for the storm to pass, but about learning to navigate through it.
Thank you, James. This has been a fascinating journey from ancient shipwreck to timeless wisdom. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on Philosophical Journeys. Until next time, keep exploring.